Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls her age. While her classmates worried about makeup and boyfriends, she spent her free time swimming laps at the local pool and studying marine biology books. At 19, she had already completed 2 years of college with perfect grades and dreamed of becoming an oceanographer. Her small coastal town of Millbrook rarely saw excitement, but Sarah found adventure in the crashing waves and endless blue horizon that stretched beyond their quiet harbor. The trouble started when Victor Kozlov moved to town with his crew of wealthy friends from the city. Victor's father owned a massive shipping company, and the family had bought the largest mansion on the cliff overlooking the ocean. Victor was 23, tall and handsome in a cold way that made some girls swoon. But Sarah saw through his charming smile to the cruelty underneath. She had witnessed him and his friends bullying younger kids at the beach, throwing their belongings into the water and laughing as the children cried. One evening at Murphy's Diner, the only restaurant in town that stayed open late, Sarah was studying for her marine ecology exam when Victor and his 3 friends walked in. They were loud and clearly drunk, demanding the best table even though the place was nearly empty. Sarah tried to ignore them, but their voices carried across the small restaurant. "Look at the little bookworm," Victor said, pointing at Sarah. "Always so serious, always so perfect. Bet she thinks she's better than everyone else." His friends laughed, but Sarah kept her eyes on her textbook. She had learned long ago that ignoring bullies was usually the best strategy. But Victor wasn't the type to be ignored. He walked over to her table, his expensive shoes clicking on the worn linoleum floor. "I'm talking to you, princess," he said, leaning over her table. The smell of alcohol was strong on his breath. "My friends and I are having a conversation about you." "I'm not interested," Sarah replied calmly, not looking up from her book. She had dealt with difficult people before, and staying calm usually worked. But this only made Victor angrier. He grabbed her textbook and slammed it shut, his hand covering her notes. "You think you're too good for us? You think because you get good grades and swim around in that dirty harbor, you're some kind of special?" The diner had gone quiet. Mrs. Murphy, the elderly owner, watched nervously from behind the counter. The few other customers pretended not to notice, but Sarah could feel their eyes on her. This was a small town where everyone knew everyone, and confrontations like this became gossip for weeks. "Please give me back my book," Sarah said quietly, finally meeting Victor's eyes. They were pale blue and cold like winter ice. "I have an exam tomorrow." "Oh, she has an exam," Victor said mockingly to his friends. "The Little Mermaid needs to study." His friends laughed again, but their laughter sounded forced now. Even they seemed uncomfortable with how far Victor was pushing this. Sarah stood up slowly. She was tall for a girl, almost as tall as Victor, and years of swimming had made her strong. "Give me my book, Victor. This doesn't have to be a problem." "Everything's already a problem, sweetheart," Victor sneered. "You've been a problem since the day you decided you were too good to talk to me. Do you know who my father is? Do you know what my family could do for a nobody like you?" "I know exactly who you are," Sarah said, her voice steady but her heart racing. "You're a bully who thinks money makes you special, but money can't buy respect and it can't make people like you." The words hit Victor like a slap. His face turned red, and for a moment Sarah thought he might actually hit her. Instead, he threw her textbook across the room, where it hit the wall and fell to the floor with pages scattered. "You'll regret that," he said quietly, his voice so low only she could hear it. "Nobody talks to me like that. Nobody." He turned and walked back to his friends, throwing money on the counter without ordering anything. As they left, Victor looked back at Sarah one more time. The look in his eyes made her stomach turn cold. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was something much worse. It was a promise. Sarah picked up her book and tried to put the scattered pages back in order, but her hands were shaking slightly. Mrs. Murphy came over with a cup of hot coffee, even though Sarah hadn't ordered one. "Don't mind him, dear," the older woman said gently. "Boys like that always get what's coming to them eventually." But Sarah wasn't so sure. In her experience, boys like Victor usually got away with everything. Money and family connections had a way of making problems disappear. As she walked home that night along the dark coastal road, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The ocean waves crashed against the rocks below, and the sound that usually comforted her seemed ominous now. She didn't know that Victor was already making plans. She didn't know that his wounded pride and drunken anger were turning into something dangerous. and she definitely didn't know that her words had started a chain of events that would change everything. The next few days were quiet, but Sarah noticed Victor's car driving slowly past her house several times. She saw him and his friends at the harbor, watching her when she went for her evening swims. They never approached her again, but their presence felt like a dark cloud following her around town. Sarah's parents noticed her unease but didn't press when she said everything was fine. They were good people who worked hard and trusted their daughter to handle her own problems. Her father worked at the shipyard and her mother was a nurse at the small local clinic. They had raised Sarah to be independent and strong, never imagining that these very qualities might put her in danger. As the weekend approached, Sarah heard rumors that Victor was planning a big party on his father's yacht. Half the young people in town were invited, but Sarah wasn't among them. She was relieved. The last thing she wanted was to spend time around Victor and his friends. But Victor had other plans for Sarah Martinez. Plans that would test everything she had ever learned about survival, courage, and the power of the ocean she loved so much. Plans that would bring her face to face with people who understood the water in ways Victor could never imagine. The storm was coming, both literally and figuratively, and Sarah was about to find herself in the fight of her life. The weekend arrived with unseasonably warm weather that brought most of Millbrook's residents to the harbor and beaches. Sarah spent Saturday morning helping her neighbor, old Captain Henderson, repair his fishing nets. The retired fisherman had been like a grandfather to her since childhood, teaching her about ocean currents, weather patterns, and the secret spots where the best fish could be found. "Storm coming tomorrow night," Captain Henderson said, squinting at the horizon where thin clouds were gathering. "Not a big one, but enough to make the water rough. You stay out of the harbor tomorrow evening, Sarah girl." Sarah nodded, trusting the old man's weather sense more than any forecast on television. She was planning to spend Sunday studying anyway. Her marine ecology exam was Monday morning, and despite the incident with Victor, she was determined not to let it affect her grades. That evening, she could hear music and laughter coming from the direction of Victor's mansion on the cliff. The party had apparently started early and sounded like it would go late into the night. Sarah was glad to be home with her books and a cup of tea, far away from whatever chaos Victor and his friends were creating. But around 11 o'clock, her peaceful evening was interrupted by a knock at the door. Her parents were already asleep, so Sarah quietly went to answer it, expecting maybe one of her classmates with a question about the upcoming exam. Instead, she found Jessica Wong, a girl from her chemistry class, standing on the porch looking worried. "Sarah, thank goodness you're still awake," Jessica said. "I need your help. I'm at Victor's party, and my little brother Tommy is there too. He's only 16, but he snuck in somehow. These older guys are giving him alcohol and he's really drunk. I tried to get him to leave, but he won't listen to me. You're the only person I know who's not afraid of Victor." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She didn't want to go anywhere near Victor's party, but she couldn't let a 16-year-old kid get hurt because of his poor judgment. "Can't you call his parents?" Sarah asked. "They're out of town for the weekend," Jessica replied. "Please, Sarah, Tommy looks up to you. If you tell him to leave, he'll listen." Against her better judgment, Sarah grabbed her jacket and followed Jessica to her car. The drive to Victor's mansion took only 10 minutes, but it felt much longer. As they got closer, Sarah could see lights blazing from every window of the huge house, and cars were parked along the road for half a mile. The party was even wilder than Sarah had imagined. Music pounded from expensive speakers, and young people were everywhere, drinking, dancing, and jumping into the large swimming pool behind the house. The yacht in the private harbor below the mansion was lit up like a floating palace, with more partygoers visible on its decks. Sarah found Tommy Wong passed out on a couch in one of the mansion's sitting rooms, surrounded by empty beer bottles and older guys who thought his condition was hilarious. She and Jessica managed to get him on his feet, and were heading toward the door when Victor appeared, blocking their path. Well, he said, his words slightly slurred, but his eyes sharp and focused. "Look who decided to join my party after all. The little mermaid herself." "We're just leaving," Sarah said firmly, supporting Tommy's weight as he swayed between her and Jessica. "This kid needs to go home." "Nobody leaves my party early," Victor said, stepping closer. "Especially not without having a drink with the host. It's rude." His 3 friends had appeared behind him, forming a wall between Sarah's group and the exit. She recognized them from around town, Marcus, the mayor's son, Brett, whose father owned the biggest car dealership in the county, and Kyle, whose family controlled most of the waterfront property. They were all bigger than Sarah, and they were all drunk. "Let us pass, Victor," Sarah said, but she could hear the tension in her own voice. There were too many people at this party. The music was too loud, and she was starting to realize that Jessica might have led her into a trap. "You know what your problem is?" Victor said, ignoring her request. "You think you're special. You think because you're smart and you can swim fast, you're better than everyone else. But you're nothing special, Sarah Martinez. You're just a poor girl from a poor family in a nowhere town." The words stung because there was some truth to them, but Sarah refused to show it. "Move out of the way, Victor, now." Instead, Victor smiled and pulled out his phone. "Hey, everyone," he called out loudly. "Come here and meet our local celebrity, the girl who thinks she's too good for us regular people." More people began gathering around them, drawn by Victor's voice and the promise of drama. Sarah felt the walls closing in. Tommy was barely conscious, Jessica looked terrified, and they were outnumbered by at least 20-1. "You want to leave so badly?" Victor continued, his voice carrying over the music. "Fine, but first you're going to apologize for embarrassing me in front of the whole town. You're going to admit that you were wrong, and you're going to ask me nicely if you can stay at my party." "I'm not apologizing for anything," Sarah said. "And I don't want to stay at your party." The crowd around them was getting larger and more excited. Sarah could see phones coming out, people getting ready to record whatever happened next. In a small town, this kind of drama would be talked about for months. "Then maybe you need to cool off," Victor said, and nodded to his friends. Before Sarah could react, Marcus and Brett grabbed her arms while Kyle took Jessica and the barely conscious Tommy. The crowd followed as Victor led them through the mansion and down a path toward the private harbor where his father's yacht was moored. "Victor, this is crazy," Sarah said, struggling against the hands holding her. "Let us go. This has gone far enough." But Victor was beyond listening to reason. The alcohol, his wounded pride, and the crowd of people watching had turned him into someone even more dangerous than usual. At the harbor, he gestured toward the yacht. "You love the water so much, right?" he said. "You're always swimming around out there like you own the place. Well, let's see how much you love it when you don't have a choice." Sarah's blood went cold as she realized what he was planning. The harbor water was rough even on calm nights, and with a storm coming, it would be dangerous even for a strong swimmer like her. At night in her clothes, it could be deadly. "Victor, don't do this," she pleaded. "Someone could get hurt." "Someone already got hurt," he replied. "My reputation, my pride. And now it's your turn." The crowd from the party had followed them down to the harbor, and Sarah could see that some of them were starting to look uncomfortable. This had started as entertainment, but it was turning into something much more serious. "Come on, Victor," someone called from the back of the crowd. "Just let them go home." But Victor was too far gone to back down now. He had made his threat in front of too many people, and his ego wouldn't let him appear weak. He nodded to his friends, and before anyone could stop them, they forced Sarah, Jessica, and Tommy onto the yacht. The next few minutes would change everything, and Sarah was about to learn that the ocean she loved so much could be both her greatest enemy and her most powerful ally. On the yacht, Sarah tried to keep calm as Victor's friends held them near the railing. The vessel rocked gently in the harbor, but she could feel the underlying power of the ocean beneath them. Tommy was still barely conscious, and Jessica was crying quietly, which only seemed to encourage Victor's cruel behavior. "You know what I love about having money?" Victor said, pacing back and forth on the deck while the crowd of partygoers watched from the dock. "It means I can do whatever I want and nobody can stop me. My daddy owns half this town and the other half owes him money." Sarah looked around desperately for any way to escape, but Marcus and Brett had tight grips on her arms. The yacht was anchored about 50 feet from shore, and even if she could break free, she would have to leave Jessica and Tommy behind. "This is kidnapping, Victor," Sarah said loudly, hoping someone in the crowd would realize how serious this had become. "People will go to jail for this." Victor laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Kidnapping? We're just having a pool party, except our pool happens to be the entire ocean." He gestured to Kyle, who started the yacht's engine. The sound was loud in the night air, and Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized they were leaving the harbor. Several people in the crowd on the dock began shouting for Victor to stop, but their voices were lost in the engine noise and the distance that was already growing between the yacht and shore. "Where are we going?" Jessica asked through her tears. Just a little cruise, Victor replied.
Sarah here loves the water so much. I thought she might enjoy seeing it from a different perspective. As they moved away from the protected harbor and into the open ocean,
the yacht began to rock more violently. The storm that Captain Henderson had predicted was still hours away, but the sea was already getting rougher. Sarah could feel the change in the water's movement, the way the waves were building and becoming more unpredictable. Tommy suddenly came awake, probably from the motion of the boat, and immediately began throwing up over the railing. This seemed to amuse Victor and his friends, but it made Sarah even more worried. A sick, drunk teenager would have no chance in the water if something went wrong. "Victor, this is insane," she said, raising her voice over the engine noise. "Turn around and take us back." "You've made your point, have I?" Victor asked, moving closer to her. "Because I don't think you understand yet. I don't think you realize what happens to people who disrespect me and my family." The yacht was now about 2 miles from shore, far enough that the lights of Millbrook looked like tiny stars. Sarah had swum in these waters many times, but never at night, never in rough seas, and never wearing jeans and sneakers that would drag her down. "You see that water down there?" Victor continued, pointing over the railing. "It's dark, it's cold, and it's very, very deep. Fish live down there that could swallow you whole. Sharks come through these waters at night looking for easy meals." He was trying to scare her, and Sarah had to admit it was working. But she also knew something Victor didn't. She had spent years studying these waters, learning about the currents and tides from Captain Henderson. She knew which way the water moved and where it would carry someone who fell in. More importantly, she knew how to survive in the ocean even in conditions like this. "Let Jessica and Tommy go back," Sarah said. "This is between you and me. They don't deserve this." "Nobody deserves anything," Victor replied. "People get what I decide to give them." He nodded to his friends, and suddenly Sarah found herself being pushed toward the railing. The crowd back on shore was too far away to help now, and she could see that even some of Victor's own friends were looking uncertain about what was happening. "Victor, stop," Marcus said quietly. "This is going too far, man." "Shut up," Victor snapped. "Are you with me or not?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and Sarah realized that this was a turning point. Victor's friends could still stop this, but it would mean standing up to him and potentially facing his family's wealth and power later. One by one, they chose Victor's side over doing the right thing. "Please," Jessica begged. "We'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt us." "I'm not going to hurt you," Victor said with a smile that made Sarah's blood freeze. "The ocean's going to hurt you. I'm just going to help you get acquainted." Before anyone could react, he gave Sarah a hard push. She had been expecting it and managed to grab the railing, but her feet slipped on the wet deck. For a moment she hung there, suspended between the yacht and the dark water below. "Let go, Sarah," Victor said, prying at her fingers. "Let go and swim back to shore. Show everyone how special you think you are." Sarah looked down at the churning water and made a decision that would save her life. Instead of fighting Victor's grip on the railing, she let go on her own terms, pushing herself away from the yacht as she fell. She hit the water hard, and the cold shock nearly knocked the breath out of her. The ocean immediately tried to drag her down, her waterlogged clothes becoming heavy anchors. But Sarah had been preparing for this moment her entire life, even though she hadn't known it. As she surfaced, gasping for air, she could hear Victor shouting from the yacht above. "There's your precious water, princess. Swim home if you can." But instead of swimming toward shore, Sarah began moving in a different direction. She was following a current that Captain Henderson had taught her about, one that would take her toward a small rocky island about a mile away. The island wasn't inhabited, but it had something she needed, a radio beacon that the Coast Guard used for navigation. As she swam through the increasingly rough water, Sarah could hear the yacht's engine getting fainter. Victor thought he had won, that he had taught her a lesson she would never forget. He had no idea that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Because Sarah Martinez wasn't just a college student who loved the ocean. She was a young woman who had been raised by the sea itself, taught its secrets by people who understood its power, and she was about to discover that she wasn't alone in these waters. 3 miles away, a U.S. Navy patrol boat was running a routine training exercise, led by a team of SEALs who knew these waters better than anyone. They had seen the yacht's unusual movement on their radar, and were already heading in that direction to investigate the ocean that Victor thought would be Sarah's grave was about to become his worst nightmare. Sarah had been in the water for 20 minutes when she first heard the sound of a different boat engine. She had reached the small rocky island and managed to climb onto its narrow beach, her body shivering uncontrollably from the cold water and exhaustion. The radio beacon was exactly where Captain Henderson had told her it would be, mounted on a metal pole near the island's highest point. But before she could reach the beacon, powerful searchlights suddenly illuminated the water around the island. Sarah's heart jumped, thinking Victor had come back to finish what he started. Instead, she saw a sleek military patrol boat approaching carefully through the rough waves. "This is the U.S. Navy," a voice called through a loudspeaker. "We received a distress signal from this location. Is anyone in need of assistance?" Sarah waved both arms above her head, shouting as loud as she could. "Here, I'm here." Within minutes, a small inflatable boat was launched from the patrol vessel, carrying 2 men in military gear. As they pulled up to the rocky beach, Sarah could see they were Navy SEALs, their equipment and bearing making their elite status obvious even in the darkness. The first SEAL to reach her was a tall, powerful man with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. "I'm Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison," he said, wrapping a warm blanket around Sarah's shoulders. "Are you injured?" "I don't think so," Sarah replied through chattering teeth. "But there are 2 other people in trouble. A yacht took us out here and they pushed me overboard. There's a girl named Jessica and a 16-year-old boy named Tommy still on that boat." The second SEAL, who introduced himself as Petty Officer Martinez, immediately radioed this information back to their patrol boat. Sarah noticed he shared her last name, which felt like a strange coincidence in an already surreal night. "Can you describe the yacht?" Chief Morrison asked as they helped Sarah into their inflatable boat. "Direction, size, number of people aboard?" Sarah told them everything she could remember about Victor's yacht, including the fact that it belonged to Kozlov Shipping Company. She described Victor and his friends, the party at the mansion, and the events that led to her being thrown overboard. "Kozlov," Chief Morrison repeated, his expression darkening. "We know that name. His father's ships have been involved in some questionable activities lately. Nothing we could prove, but enough to make us pay attention." As they reached the patrol boat, Sarah was amazed by the level of activity on deck. The SEALs moved with precision and purpose, each knowing exactly what to do without needing orders. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, took Sarah's statement personally, while the crew prepared to locate Victor's yacht. "This isn't just about rescuing your friends," Lieutenant Commander Chen explained. "Kozlov's yacht wasn't supposed to be out here tonight. This area is restricted for military exercises and no civilian boats were given permission to enter. That makes this a federal matter." Within an hour, they had located Victor's yacht using thermal imaging and radar. Sarah watched from the patrol boat's bridge as the SEALs approached the larger vessel, their professional movements a sharp contrast to the chaos and drunkenness they found aboard. Through binoculars, Sarah could see the confusion on Victor's face as armed Navy SEALs boarded his yacht. His arrogant smile disappeared quickly when he realized these weren't local police who might be influenced by his father's money. These were federal military personnel who didn't care about small-town politics or shipping company connections. "Vessel is secure," came the radio report from the boarding team. 2 civilians in distress, multiple intoxicated subjects, evidence of criminal activity. Jessica and Tommy were brought to the patrol boat first, both safe but shaken by their ordeal. Jessica immediately hugged Sarah, crying with relief that she was alive. Tommy, now sober from fear and seasickness, kept apologizing for getting them all into this situation. "It's not your fault," Sarah told him. "Victor made his own choices." But Victor's choices were about to have consequences he never could have imagined. The SEALs found more than just evidence of kidnapping and assault aboard the yacht. Hidden in a secret compartment, they discovered waterproof packages that contained something Victor shouldn't have had access to: detailed maps of military installations and shipping schedules for Navy vessels. "This changes everything," Lieutenant Commander Chen told Sarah privately. "Your friend Victor has apparently been involved in activities that go way beyond bullying. His father's shipping company may be part of something much bigger." As dawn began to break over the ocean, Sarah watched from the deck of the patrol boat as Victor and his friends were placed in custody. Victor's face had gone from arrogant to terrified as he began to understand the serious legal trouble he was facing. Federal charges for kidnapping, assault, and possession of classified military information carried sentences that his father's money couldn't buy him out of. Chief Morrison came to stand beside Sarah at the railing. "You did good out there," he said. "Most people wouldn't have survived what you went through. You kept your head, used your knowledge of the water, and made smart decisions under pressure." "I had a good teacher," Sarah replied, thinking of Captain Henderson and all the hours he had spent teaching her about the ocean's moods and secrets. "The ocean's not just water," Chief Morrison continued. "It's a living thing with its own personality. Some people fear it, some people think they can control it, but the smart ones learn to work with it. You're one of the smart ones." As they headed back to shore, Sarah realized that the worst night of her life had also been a turning point. She had faced down a bully and survived being thrown into the ocean at night during rough weather. More importantly, she had learned that there were people in the world who understood justice and wouldn't let criminals hide behind money and family connections. The Navy SEALs who had rescued her weren't just skilled fighters and sailors. They were protectors who took their duties seriously. Whether they were defending the country from foreign threats or rescuing a college student from local bullies who had gone too far. Victor Kozlov had thought he owned the water around Millbrook because his family had money and influence, but he was about to learn that the real owners of the ocean were people who had earned their place through courage, skill, and dedication to something bigger than themselves. The game had changed, and Victor was no longer playing by his rules. He was about to face justice from people who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or influenced by small-town politics. The Navy SEALs owned the water, and they were just getting started with Victor Kozlov. The news of Victor Kozlov's arrest spread through Millbrook faster than wildfire. By the time Sarah returned home that morning, reporters were already gathering at the harbor and federal agents had surrounded the Kozlov mansion. The party that had started as Victor's attempt to humiliate Sarah had ended with him facing federal charges that could put him in prison for decades. Sarah's parents were waiting for her when she arrived, having been contacted by the Navy about their daughter's rescue. Her mother, Maria, held her close while her father, Roberto, spoke quietly with Chief Morrison and Lieutenant Commander Chen, who had personally escorted Sarah home to ensure her safety. "The investigation is just beginning," Lieutenant Commander Chen explained to the family. "Those maps we found on the yacht contain classified information about Navy ship movements and base security. Victor Kozlov may have been involved in espionage activities, possibly without even realizing the full scope of what he was doing. Over the next few days, the true extent of the Kozlov family's criminal activities began to emerge. Federal investigators discovered that Kozlov Shipping had been using their legitimate business as cover for smuggling operations, moving everything from stolen military equipment to classified documents. Victor's father, Dmitry Kozlov, had been under surveillance for months, but investigators hadn't been able to find concrete evidence until Victor's reckless behavior led to the search of his yacht. "The irony is incredible," Chief Morrison told Sarah when he stopped by to check on her recovery. "If Victor had just left you alone, his family might have gotten away with their crimes indefinitely. His need to prove he was powerful brought down their entire operation." The story attracted national attention when news outlets learned that a college student had survived being thrown from a yacht and had inadvertently helped expose an international smuggling ring. Sarah found herself thrust into a spotlight she never wanted, with reporters camping outside her house and requests for interviews coming from major television networks. But Sarah's focus remained on her studies and her future. She had missed her marine ecology exam due to the ordeal, but her professor, Dr. Williams, arranged for her to take it privately. When Sarah scored perfectly despite everything she had been through, Dr. Williams knew he was looking at a student with exceptional resilience and dedication. "Have you ever considered a career in maritime law enforcement?" Dr. Williams asked after the exam. "The Coast Guard and Navy are always looking for people with your combination of ocean knowledge and personal courage." The suggestion intrigued Sarah, but she was more immediately concerned with the legal proceedings that would determine Victor's fate. As the key witness against him, she would need to testify before a federal grand jury and eventually at his trial. Victor's legal team, paid for by his father's rapidly dwindling resources, tried every trick they could think of to discredit Sarah's testimony. They claimed she had jumped from the yacht voluntarily, that she had exaggerated the danger she was in, and that she was seeking attention and money from the situation. But their arguments collapsed when other witnesses from the party came forward. Many of the young people who had watched Victor's escalating behavior that night were horrified when they learned the full consequences of what they had witnessed. Several of them contacted federal prosecutors to offer their own testimony about what they had seen. Marcus, Brett, and Kyle, Victor's 3 friends who had helped him kidnap Sarah and the others, quickly accepted plea deals in exchange for their cooperation. Their testimony painted a picture of Victor as an increasingly unstable young man who had become obsessed with proving his power over others. He talked about Sarah constantly. Marcus testified during his deposition. He couldn't stand that she wasn't impressed by his money or his family's influence. When she rejected him publicly at the diner, he became fixated on getting revenge. The investigation also revealed that Victor had been involved in his father's smuggling operations for over a year, though he may not have fully understood what he was doing. His job was simple: use his yacht to pick up packages from specific coordinates in international waters and bring them back to private docks owned by his father's company. He thought he was just helping with legitimate business operations. Victor was a useful idiot, explained Agent Patricia Reynolds, the FBI investigator leading the case. He was arrogant enough to think he was special, but not smart enough to ask questions about what he was really doing. His father used his son's ego and recklessness to shield the family's criminal activities. As the legal case developed, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Captain Henderson, her old mentor, brought with him a man she didn't recognize, a weathered-looking individual in his 50s who introduced himself simply as Commander Thompson. "Sarah," Commander Thompson said, "I understand you've been through quite an ordeal, but I wanted to thank you personally for what you've done. Those documents we recovered from the Kozlov yacht have helped us prevent a serious breach of national security." He explained that the intelligence Victor had been unknowingly smuggling would have given foreign agents detailed information about Navy ship movements along the entire East Coast. Several planned operations had been compromised, and American lives could have been lost if the information had reached its intended recipients. "You should be proud," Commander Thompson continued. "Your courage and quick thinking didn't just save your own life and the lives of your friends. You helped protect your country." The praise felt surreal to Sarah, who still sometimes woke up at night remembering the feeling of hitting the cold ocean water. But she was beginning to understand that her ordeal had been part of something much bigger than a small-town bully getting his revenge. As Victor's trial date approached, Sarah threw herself into her studies with renewed determination. The experience had changed her perspective on what she wanted to do with her life. She was still passionate about marine biology, but she was also drawn to the idea of using her knowledge to protect others and serve her country. The SEALs who had rescued her remained in contact, checking on her recovery and offering encouragement as she dealt with the stress of being a key witness in a federal case. Their support meant more to her than they probably realized, reminding her that there were people in the world who genuinely cared about justice and protecting others. Victor Kozlov, meanwhile, was discovering that the ocean he had tried to use as a weapon against Sarah had become his own destruction. His family's wealth was being seized by federal authorities, their reputation was destroyed, and he was facing the possibility of spending most of his adult life in prison. The water had indeed belonged to someone, but it wasn't Victor Kozlov. It belonged to people who understood its power and respected its dangers, people who used their skills to protect rather than harm others. Sarah was beginning to realize that she might be one of those people, and that her future lay not just in studying the ocean, but in protecting it and the people who depended on it. The trial was still months away, but Sarah knew that when she finally faced Victor in court, she would be ready. She had survived his worst attempt to break her, and in doing so she had discovered strength she never knew she possessed. The scared college student who had been thrown into the dark ocean was gone, replaced by a young woman who understood that real power came not from money or intimidation, but from courage, knowledge, and the willingness to stand up for what was right. Victor had thrown her into the ocean thinking it would be her grave. Instead, it had become the place where she found her true calling. The SEALs who owned the water had not only rescued her body that night, but they had also shown her a path toward a future she had never imagined possible. 6 months after that terrifying night on the ocean, Sarah stood in a federal courtroom wearing her best dress, facing Victor Kozlov across a room filled with lawyers, federal agents, and journalists. Victor looked nothing like the arrogant young man who had terrorized her at the diner. Prison clothing had replaced his expensive suits, and the confident smirk was gone, replaced by the hollow look of someone who had finally understood the consequences of his actions. The trial had drawn national attention, partly because of the espionage charges against the Kozlov family, but mostly because of the dramatic story of a college student who had survived being thrown into the ocean and had inadvertently helped bring down an international smuggling operation. Sarah had tried to avoid the media circus, but her testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case. Miss Martinez, the federal prosecutor, began as Sarah took the witness stand. Please tell the court about the events of March 15th of this year. Sarah had practiced this moment many times, but actually facing Victor in court was harder than she had expected. She could see him watching her, and for a moment, she was transported back to that night on the yacht, feeling helpless and afraid. Then she noticed Chief Morrison and Lieutenant Commander Chen sitting in the gallery, along with several other SEALs who had become friends during the investigation. Their presence reminded her that she was no longer the frightened girl Victor had tried to destroy. She told her story clearly and completely, from the confrontation at the diner to the moment Victor pushed her from the yacht. The courtroom was silent as she described swimming through rough water in the darkness, using everything Captain Henderson had taught her about ocean currents to reach the small island where the Navy patrol found her. Victor's defense attorney tried to paint Sarah as an opportunist who had exaggerated the danger she faced, but the strategy backfired badly. Jessica and Tommy testified about their own terror that night, and several witnesses from the party described Victor's increasingly erratic behavior leading up to the kidnapping. The most damaging testimony came from Marcus, Brett, and Kyle, who had accepted plea deals in exchange for their cooperation. They described how Victor had become obsessed with Sarah after she rejected him, talking constantly about teaching her a lesson and showing her who really had power in Millbrook. He said the ocean would put her in her place, Marcus testified, his voice barely above a whisper. He said she thought she was so tough because she could swim, but that nobody could survive being thrown overboard at night in rough water. But the prosecution's case went far beyond the assault charges. FBI agents testified about the classified documents found hidden on Victor's yacht, explaining how this information could have compromised national security if it had reached its intended recipients. Victor's father, Dmitry Kozlov, was revealed to be part of an international network that sold American military secrets to foreign governments. The defendant may not have fully understood the significance of what he was smuggling, Agent Reynolds testified. But ignorance is not a defense when dealing with classified military information. His actions put American service members at risk and compromised ongoing operations. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Commander Thompson took the stand to explain exactly what the stolen documents contained. He described how the intelligence Victor had been smuggling would have allowed enemy agents to predict Navy ship movements, potentially leading to attacks on American vessels. If this information had reached its intended destination, Commander Thompson testified, American sailors could have died. The defendant's criminal actions went far beyond a personal vendetta against Miss Martinez. They constituted an act of treason, whether he realized it or not. Victor's defense team had hoped to portray him as a misguided young man who had made mistakes, but didn't deserve the harsh sentences the prosecution was seeking. But as witness after witness testified about his deliberate cruelty and his involvement in his father's criminal enterprise, it became clear that Victor was not the victim in this story. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: kidnapping, assault, possession of classified documents, and conspiracy to commit espionage. Victor showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but Sarah could see his hands shaking as he realized his life as he knew it was over. During the sentencing phase, Sarah was given the opportunity to address the court about how Victor's actions had affected her life. She had written a victim impact statement, but when the moment came, she set her prepared remarks aside and spoke from her heart. "Your Honor," she began, "Victor Kozlov tried to destroy me because I wouldn't bow down to his money and his family's influence. He thought throwing me into the ocean would break me, would prove that he had power over me. But what he actually did was show me who I really am." She turned to look directly at Victor for the first time since entering the courtroom. "You gave me the greatest gift anyone could give, even though you didn't mean to. You showed me that I'm stronger than I ever knew." that I can survive anything, and that real power comes from courage and integrity, not from money or intimidation. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. Because of what you did to me, I've decided to dedicate my life to protecting others. I'm joining the Coast Guard after I graduate, and I'm going to spend my career making sure that bullies like you can never use the ocean to hurt innocent people. The courtroom was completely silent as Sarah finished her statement. Even some of the journalists were wiping away tears, moved by the grace and strength of a young woman who had turned her worst nightmare into a source of purpose and determination. Judge Harrison, a veteran federal judge who had seen thousands of cases during his career, took a moment before delivering Victor's sentence. "Mr. Kozlov," he said, "your actions on the night in question were not just criminal, they were cowardly. You used your family's wealth and influence to terrorize innocent people, and you showed complete disregard for human life when you threw Miss Martinez into dangerous waters." He paused, looking directly at Victor. "You also betrayed your country by participating in activities that put American service members at risk. The fact that you may not have fully understood the implications of your actions does not excuse the harm you caused." The sentence was harsh but fair. 25 years in federal prison for the assault and kidnapping charges, plus an additional 15 years for the espionage-related charges, to be served consecutively. Victor would be nearly 60 years old before he would be eligible for parole, and even then, his release would depend on his behavior in prison and his cooperation with ongoing investigations into his father's criminal network. As Victor was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at Sarah one last time. But instead of the hatred or defiance she might have expected, she saw something else in his eyes. Regret. Maybe, she thought, he was finally beginning to understand the true cost of his actions. 2 years after Victor Kozlov was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison, Sarah Martinez stood on the deck of a Coast Guard cutter as it sliced through the same waters where she had nearly died. But this time she wasn't a victim struggling to survive. She was Petty Officer Second Class Martinez, a proud member of the United States Coast Guard, and she owned these waters just as much as the Navy SEALs who had saved her life. Sarah had graduated from college summa cum laude, with a degree in marine biology, but her real education had come from the trials and challenges that followed her ordeal with Victor. The experience had changed her fundamentally, transforming her from a quiet student into a confident leader who understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. Her Coast Guard training had been demanding, but nothing compared to the night she had fought for her life in dark, rough water. When other recruits complained about the difficulty of their rescue swimmer training, Sarah would think back to that terrifying swim to the small island, and everything else seemed manageable by comparison. The Coast Guard had been the perfect fit for Sarah's combination of scientific knowledge and newfound sense of purpose. She specialized in search and rescue operations, using her deep understanding of ocean currents and weather patterns to find people who were lost at sea. Her fellow Coast Guard members quickly learned that when Sarah Martinez said someone could be found, they could be found. Today's mission was particularly meaningful for Sarah. They were responding to a distress call from a small fishing boat that had broken down about 10 miles from Millbrook. The boat carried a family of 4, including 2 young children, and they had been drifting for several hours as a storm approached. "Martinez, your lead on this one," said Chief Petty Officer Williams, the mission commander. "Your knowledge of these local waters makes you our best bet for a quick rescue." Sarah nodded, already studying the charts and weather data. She recognized the area where the fishing boat was stranded, a tricky section of water where conflicting currents could push a disabled vessel in unexpected directions. Most rescue teams would search in a standard grid pattern, but Sarah knew these waters had their own personality. The current's going to push them northeast toward Devil's Teeth Rocks, she told the team as they prepared their equipment. "If we don't reach them in the next 2 hours, they'll be in serious danger." The rescue operation went exactly as Sarah had predicted. They found the stranded family just as their boat was being pushed toward the dangerous rocks, and Sarah personally operated the rescue hoist that brought the 2 frightened children to safety. As the family was reunited on the Coast Guard cutter, the father grabbed Sarah's hands with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for bringing us home." But for Sarah, this rescue was about more than just doing her job. It was about proving that the ocean could be a place of salvation as well as danger. That the same waters where Victor had tried to destroy her could be used to save lives and protect families. After the rescue, as they headed back to port, Sarah received an unexpected radio message. Coast Guard Cutter Resolute, this is Navy Patrol Boat 77. Permission to come alongside? Sarah smiled as she recognized the voice on the radio. It was Chief Morrison, now promoted to senior chief, leading the same SEAL team that had rescued her 2 years earlier. The Navy patrol boat pulled up beside the Coast Guard cutter, and Morrison called across the water between the vessels. Heard you pulled off another perfect rescue today, Martinez, he shouted with a grin. Some people are calling you the guardian angel of these waters. Just doing my job, Senior Chief, Sarah called back, but she couldn't hide her pride in the compliment. Later that evening, back at the Coast Guard station, Sarah received a phone call that brought the past full circle. It was Jessica Wong, now a successful nurse working at a hospital in the state capital, calling with surprising news. Sarah, you're not going to believe this, Jessica said excitedly. I was working in the emergency room today when they brought in a prisoner from the Federal Correctional Facility. He'd been beaten up pretty badly by other inmates. Sarah felt her stomach tighten, somehow knowing what Jessica was about to tell her. It was Victor, Jessica continued. He's been having a rough time in prison. Apparently the other inmates don't like people who put military personnel at risk. He asked about you, Sarah. He wanted to know if you were okay, if you'd forgiven him. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. She had thought about Victor occasionally over the past 2 years, usually when she was helping families in distress or training other Coast Guard members. She had wondered if he ever thought about the consequences of his actions, if he understood the lives he had affected. What did you tell him? Sarah finally asked. I told him you were a hero, Jessica replied. I told him you joined the Coast Guard and were saving lives every day. I told him that his worst moment had become your greatest strength. That night, Sarah stood on the pier near her Coast Guard station, looking out at the ocean under a full moon. The water was calm and peaceful, nothing like the rough seas she had faced during her ordeal with Victor. But she knew that beneath the surface, powerful currents were always moving, carrying both danger and opportunity in their flow. She thought about the phone call with Jessica and Victor's question about forgiveness. Sarah realized that she had forgiven him, not because he deserved it, but because carrying hatred would have poisoned her own life. Victor had given her something valuable, even though he hadn't meant to. He had shown her who she really was and what she was capable of becoming. The ocean had become Sarah's ally, her workplace, and her calling. Every day she used her knowledge of its moods and movements to help people in trouble, to bring families back together, to prove that courage and skill could triumph over chaos and fear. Victor Kozlov had thought he could use the water as a weapon, but he had been wrong about who really owned these waters. They belonged to people like Sarah and the SEALs who had saved her, people who understood that true power came from protecting others rather than harming them. As Sarah walked back toward the Coast Guard station, she passed a group of young recruits who were studying for their navigation exam. One of them, a nervous-looking young man, asked if she had any advice for dealing with emergency rescues in rough water. Remember that the ocean isn't your enemy, Sarah told him. It's just a force of nature that doesn't care about your plans or your fears. Respect it, learn from it, and use your knowledge to work with it instead of against it. And never forget that every person you save has a family waiting for them to come home. The recruit nodded seriously, clearly recognizing the wisdom in her words. As Sarah continued toward her quarters, she smiled, thinking about how far she had come from the frightened college student who had been thrown into the darkness 2 years earlier. Victor had thrown her into the ocean thinking it would break her. Instead, it had forged her into exactly the person she was meant to become. The SEALs owned the water, but so did she. And she would spend the rest of her life making sure that the ocean remained a place where courage triumphed over cruelty, where the strong protected the weak, and where bullies like Victor Kozlov learned that their money and influence meant nothing against the tide of justice. The water had chosen its own, and Sarah Martinez was exactly where she belonged.